Welcome to the Mobley Economy Podcast. This week I have a special guest, Phil Mobley of Aveston Young. He's the Director of Occupier Insight. It's going to be a great episode. Very happy to have with me today Phil. Phil, thanks for joining us. The big topic today, why do companies need culture and do digital companies create culture in 2021?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here. This is a topic that I've got both a personal and professional interest in. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for coming together here virtually, this is one of the greatest things about the new hybrid workforce is that we can get together in these type of events, something we didn't have as much access to before the pandemic. Um, I find that so many companies today are focusing on hiring and the cultures that go along with that. So, one of the things that we see is that companies are trying to achieve their business goals and by creating a culture. What are you finding?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yesterday, in fact, at my office, we had a first office-wide gathering where we got together and had some hors d'oeuvres and some drinks and have some great space that overlooks Boston Harbor. And it was very fun to be kind of participating in building that culture in an in-person way again, and brought back some positive memories of the past. So yeah, absolutely, it's a big issue, and as someone who in the relatively recent past onboarded remotely, it was nice to have that kind of almost finishing piece of it that happened in person.
Why don't you give us a little bit of your background, Phil? You've been, we know in the space for 15 years.
Yeah, sure. So I started, as many people do who are associated with commercial real estate, almost falling into it by accident. I was a researcher by trade, worked for 9 years for a company called Kingsley Associates, which is a research and consulting firm that focuses on the commercial real estate space. And so through that, got to know people in the industry, property managers, asset managers, brokers, and tenants, and found that I really loved being in the industry. After Kingsley, I went to a software company called Building Engines that focuses on this space, particularly on the operations side of the space. And then I sort of got the hankering after, 12 plus years, more than that. I'd actually like to move inside the industry and become part of the insight function in the commercial real estate space. And so, um, through the pandemic year of 2020, was able to make that happen kind of late in the year, and I'm now director of occupier insight at Avis and Young. So I'm kind of on what heretofore I would have said is the client side, but now actually part of the industry itself.
Yeah, and Phil and I came together when you were at Building Engines through a trade organization called BOMA, um, which you're still a member of, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. BOEM is great. I've got a lot of folks that I've met there that I consider personal friends, as well as industry colleagues. So it's been a fulfilling part of my career, and a very beneficial part of my career to be associated with that organization.
Yeah, we found it. One of the founders of Moblz, Becky Hanner, is a BOMA Fellows, and that's one reason she's part of our company is her relationship with BOMA and what it brings in such a good organization. We've been very happy that her and I have been able to speak at so many of those events. And on the culture front, it's amazing the culture that BOMA fosters. But why do you think companies need to focus on culture here in 2021?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that we're human beings. If you look back to the Industrial Revolution, and not getting too meta about it, but there's been sort of this tendency to turn human beings into cogs in a machine. Whether that's on the factory floor or whether that's on the office floor, right? And offices at various points have been kind of people warehouses and have neglected the fact that we are human beings. But really, that's not when we perform our best, is in those settings when we're turned into cogs. We need those relationships with each other. We need social and physical cues that we are secure in the environment that we're working in. And part of that is knowing what is it that we value as a group of people that are trying to pull together for a common purpose. Part of it is, how do we behave, how do we not behave, what are things that we do and don't do and say and interact with each other in various ways. So a lot of that is learned by observation. And to your point at the beginning of the show today, we're able to do that a lot more than we used to be able to do via tools like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and GoToMeeting, et cetera. So video conferencing helps us fulfill some of that observational learning. But it's not the same as being in person. It's not the same as being able, sort of in your peripheral vision, if you will, to see how other people are behaving and kind of helping to live out the culture of the organization, whether they're doing it in an intentional way or not.
Oh yeah, and I like what you said about make sure people are human beings and treated like human beings. You know, the Mechanical Turk was a great model for how to mechanize. I think it was a product line that actually Amazon created, and then you look at the machine that they became. Um, One of the big questions is, can a virtual company have culture? And my answer is definitely yes. It's whether it has the culture you want to be known for, because I think that's some way where a company like Amazon has struggled is they have so many different cultures, and some of their cultures, by treating people like machines, has worked against them here over the last little bit. Um, so,
Yeah.
and I like what you said about, the people warehouses. That's something we definitely see, and getting the people together is a big focus to it, um, for sure. It's encouraging to see how many people and how many companies have been able to change. What's some of the biggest change that you've seen in some of the office buildings and locations that you see that have been working?
Well, I think there's a realization, right, that from now forward, we want to use our physical workspaces as a way to be much more intentional about the kind of culture that we're creating. I mean, we're going to have a culture of some form, whether we want to or not. And that absolutely can be accomplished, or can sort of be accomplished by inertia through an entirely virtual organization. Um, and by the same token, I think it's a mistake to say that, okay, well, once we get everyone together in the same physical space, then that's automatically going to generate this thing we call culture, and we're all of a sudden going to perform better. I don't think either of those extremes is true. But I do think that thinking about workplace and the presence of each other together in a way in the context of culture and being more intentional about that is absolutely a focus that's here now and is going to continue. If you think about it, there are ways in which anybody who's ever worked in an office, right, has some cultural context in common with anyone else who's ever worked in an office. That's why shows like The Office are funny to us, right? We can imagine those scenarios, which, that was a pretty dysfunctional culture they had at various points in fictional Scranton, PA. But we get that because we've experienced similar aspects of it. But I think the key is, as you were moving forward and thinking about, okay, well, how can we have a culture that's more of what we want? Um, then it's about making spaces that sort of align with how we want to treat each other, how we want to behave around each other. And that requires a lot of thought, and it requires, I think, some other aspects that we'll talk about some more as we move forward, and in particular, technology, right?
Sure.
That's going to become an important part of being intentional about using your workplace as a culture builder.
Yeah, Dunder Mifflin is a great example of a place trying to create culture and trying to force culture. So there's so many episodes, and I think so many people who've worked in the office buildings can so see it. Even if you work for a company that has great culture, then you find there's still parallels of, boy, I couldn't believe that this person did this. And I see it with when we go into commercial properties and other stuff I do around technology all the time, where somebody is trying to force culture into a space. One of the hot items today is hiring a chief people officer, which we think is really good. And then the next thing that person does is create the culture team to see how can we create a culture. And some of those teams work well, and sometimes it works out to be like an episode of The Office, that they're going to try to force culture upon everybody. And it just like in The Office, it backfires most of the time when you try to force culture.
When you try to force culture top down and try to define that very rigidly, then what you end up with is cult, not culture, right?
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
and I think if you want a healthier culture, and I'm not a human resources specialist by any means, but I have researched kind of how culture interplays with office space in particular. And so one of the things that is very impactful is that um, we have needs, right, as human beings, but also as workers. And so those needs, if you remember your psychology 101 class, which most of us can't forget who went through that, you have basic needs: the physical, food, clothing, shelter, etc., and those progress up through social needs, recognition, achievement, those sorts of needs, and you finally get to this place, according to Abraham Maslow, of self-actualization, right, where you're performing at your highest potential. Well, the same is true in an organization, and cultural elements really are those. They permeate all the way down, but the ones that you want to get to are those higher order ones, where you're establishing secure relationships among people who are both parallel to you and maybe further up the hierarchy than you, your superiors, the people that you're working for and with. And to get to a place where you have kind of a security in those relationships, and then by extension you're able to build on top of that this recognition of achievement, and a culture of sharing credit rather than hoarding credit, things that are healthy in building performance and engagement. That's pretty difficult to do if you don't have a way to have everyone playing by the same playbook. And
Right.
so if everyone is virtual, right? If everyone is virtual all the time, then I would argue that you can create a consistent culture, but maybe not quite as deep a culture as you might want. And on the other hand, if everyone is together all the time physically, you can do both. You can be consistent and you can build depth. Now that doesn't automatically mean you're going to do something that's healthy, but it does mean you're going to do something that's consistent and deep and permeating. I think one of the big challenges we have going forward is we're going to have people distributed and hybridized. At AY, we call it the multiverse of work, right? Various locations at which people will be doing their jobs in a more kind of structured way, or a more intentional way than we did in the past. And so trying to build both the depth and consistency across that multiverse of locations, I think, is going to be a big organizational challenge for companies.
I think it's a big organizational challenge for companies not in the tech space for sure. My company is parent company of Moblz WTE is 18 years old. We've been virtual and hybridized for that entire 18 years. So for us, when stuff like the pandemic happened and we had to go virtual, there was hardly any impact. It was more about how to keep the culture for the office people. And we see many of our clients and people we work with very much struggle because now they're doing what we've been doing for so many years, which is having to adopt VPNs, instant messenger, remote work policies, BYOD device policies, and the time for them to catch up on that took a long time. And unfortunately, it really impacted the employees, in a big way. And it impacted a lot of employees who were working remote, who had never been trained on how to work remote. That was something that we have done in our company quite a bit, which is for the remote people, we have things in place to make them feel like they're a part of the office. And I think that's a big tip is when you have a remote workforce, include them into things at the office. And one thing we have here at our office space, we have flex desk. So it's almost like a co-working space built for the tenants of a building.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of discussion, and I think frankly is not a whole lot of execution yet. So at this point, it's largely still in the discussion stage, at least for people that weren't already thinking about this, a couple of years ago. But there's a lot of discussion about flexible space and what even is the definition of flexible space. We have a team at AY that talks about this a lot. And one of the things they say is there's a really long tail of what you might consider the flexible office, right? It's not just an open seating, unassigned floor plan within your leased space, nor is it kind of the executive suite that your company controls, nor is it co-working where everyone's going into a WeWork. It's kind of all of those things and everything in between and even out past it, right? A flexible space could be the lobby of the building that you occupy. May not be the best workplace for some of your employees, but it's theoretically possible, right? So yes, we are having conversations with clients about what is the future going to look like. Maybe we don't need to control as much space through a traditional lease, but maybe we would like access to a more flexible set of space that's adjacent to a suite that we still control, but is maybe a little bit smaller than we used to have. Maybe we have a more geographically distributed workforce and we want to bring them all together occasionally, which I think is important. But also, maybe they need a place near their home that they can go that meet some of those more basic needs, the need for connectivity. So, just for example, Stanford did a study in 2020 that said about a third of workers don't actually have reliable, fast broadband to be able to do consistent video conferencing, right? So, that's a basic need that some of us take for granted, but it's real. And some people really have a very strong need to have a place that is not their home, but maybe is also not their office. And so maybe a flexible space that they can have a membership to is part of that. Going back to something else that you were talking about a minute ago, Eric, I think there is an equity angle to this. That is really complex, and I don't think we understand yet how it's all going to play out. But one of the aspects is I expect to see a lot more support for workers from their employers for those occasions when they are working remotely, whether that's at home or whether it is maybe at a work near home place. And I think that actually cycles back into this question of culture. So, for example, I worked for a company remotely for a couple of years, a few years ago, so before the pandemic. And one of the things this company did is that they funded a really nice office chair for me that I actually am still sitting in, so that I didn't have to just sit on a folding chair or pull one up from my dining room or something like that. My current company, when I started, and in part because I started remotely, they sent me a second monitor so that I can look at some notes or something up above my main screen. So companies that provide that support and do it in a way that is consistent and equitable, I think that actually starts to ingrain in a small way, hey, this is how we treat people in this organization. We treat them as people that are valuable to us. We give them the tools that they need to perform their jobs. And of course, that's not the whole answer, but I think it is an important part of trying to have that consistent culture when you're working across multiple locations.
No, I agree with that. That falls into, one of our topic questions today, how can culture help achieve business goals? And that diverse workforce is something that that is taken care of, whether they're in the office or in the virtual, is very important. I like what you're saying about getting the right office chairs and monitors. We did buy some of our employees recently gaming chairs, which were very well loved. Around the office and for the virtual people who got those. But that's a very important piece, and part of the business goals that we see, and especially here while talking with clients, is one. I don't know a company right now here in the Southeast that's not hiring, and that's big, that's small, and some of them have got big hiring goals. Fidelity is looking to hire 250, Google 250, Apple 1,000 in this area, even down to a small tech company hiring 60. So to do that, I think that a lot of them are making a big mistake, and they're relying on the job boards in the way of getting people to come through a mechanical way via the online AI systems that are going to scrub the resumes and find only the best candidates. One thing that we've done, and I would say as a tip, is look for a very diverse workforce, and see how you can do that. Hold face-to-face meetings and job fairs. But what are you seeing as ways for hiring and achieving company goals of staffing up here post-pandemic?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been on sort of both sides of that in the last year. As someone who onboarded remotely last fall, um, I think the company actually did a really good job of, providing kind of a process and making sure that I had the adequate tools and all of the things of that nature. Um, and so the process went pretty smoothly for me. Um, but I did have this thought that, okay, well, I'm at a stage in my career where I've been around a while, and so when you've been around a while, you understand the things that you need to do when you start a new job or a new role. And those things include a lot of proactive outreach, right? It's making sure that you're introducing yourself to the people that you need to be working with, that you need to be learning from. It's making sure that you get time on their calendars and understand what's important to them and how you can collaborate and what they need from you, et cetera. Um, that is a learned skill, and it's one of the things that I think is much more challenging for more entry level workers, right? The people that are just coming up and starting their careers. And in fact, in the research that we've done, we've identified several data sources that suggest this pandemic driven remote work experiment has gone pretty well for most people, but one group that has struggled a little bit more is that younger Gen Z segment of the workforce that is just starting their careers. And I think onboarding is part of that, right? Is that um, if you come if you come to a new role and you start remotely and you sort of go by the checklist of what you're supposed to do, you're going to struggle for a while because you don't have A, the existing network, and B, the sort of learned behavior of how to build that network and how to get the information and mentorship that you need. Um, so I think it's a huge, huge challenge of trying to hire in this, current time that thankfully we now it looks like are emerging from. Um, so being very, I keep using this word, but intentional about thinking through those problems is important for everyone. And I don't know that anyone has really sort of cracked the code in a way that makes it comparable to quote unquote normal. Um, but one example that I can think of is another experience I have from my career where we had a remote functional workforce, right, that did software development for us. Um, and so the interesting thing about that is that because we did it over and over again, and we knew we had a sort of identified pool of people from which to pull, we did get a fairly consistent process. But that process involved a couple of things. One of which was people on site in it was actually a near shore area that we were recruiting in. So there were people on site who were working to help find the individuals who would work on our team. And two is, even though that particular group was essentially fully remote, we did create opportunities for us to get together physically, at least in small groups on, not altogether frequent occasions, but maybe annually, where a group of people would fly down to the nearshore area, or we would bring a group of them up. And I can just remember from personal experience how much stronger those working relationships became after we were able to meet physically. And it wasn't that we felt like we were lacking the ability to work successfully together beforehand, but it just enhanced our ability to communicate with each other, to sort of understand our personalities and work more effectively together when we had those opportunities. So I think as we emerge from the pandemic, and our number one, still trying to hire, but number two, thinking about all the people that we have brought on board in the last 6 to 9 months. I know that the team I'm working with now, we're really excited about a planned in-person get together that we're going to have in a couple of months, because it'll be the first time that we've all been together, particularly those of us who are new to the company, in a long time. So um, that's absolutely something that I don't think we've really fully wrestled with, but on the other hand, I think we'll be able to almost circumvent, since we are emerging from the necessity to have to be fully remote all the time.
Yeah, I think the reason to get together and the socializing aspect is very important. We've done some great events here locally for some of the office parks we work with, where we had like a Cinco de Mayo day. And it was fun to see how many people who had not been coming into their offices showed up on the Cinco de Mayo day. It was virgin margaritas. We weren't allowed to serve alcoholic ones. But that served as a very good coming together event. And one thing I would say, and I was thinking about as you were talking here, pre-pandemic, we had so many companies we work with that were trying to buy culture. The best is, and Becky and I love to tell the story about a manager who bought a $50,000 coffee machine for their office. To Yeah, 50,000, actually $52,000, and that wasn't including the install, countertop, and build out. That was just the machine. So it was basically a barista in a box, and I really wanted to go see it, and then the pandemic happened. But you know, companies that had indoor putting greens, or all of these extravagant amenities. Now we're seeing that it's going outside. One of our things that we worked with was around frisbee golf, and that's a great thing to put in at a office park to bring people together. And then it's the responsibility of the employer and the property managers to create events of go use it and create that off the clock type of time to get people together and have that face time that's not just inside the office space, and bring the people in from the outside. But I really think that the amenity market is going to change a lot from the standpoint of the culture, because I would bet if I'm a remote employee and I hear about a $50,000 coffee maker at the office and I'm never getting to the office to see it, I'm going to be upset. I'm like, that money could have gone so many other places. And I think the companies who were buying and demanding that the properties had all these toys in some cases, that's definitely something we're seeing change. But WeWork was a big one. I mean, we loved going to the WeWork office. It had every drink you could ever imagine. That was a culture, but it was not necessarily the best culture. It was, tie back to something you said earlier, WeWork was almost cult culture, from the people there. And it was like going to a frat house a lot of times, to the WeWork in Durham, versus a good collaborative workspace that they were creating there. So I'm not sure that was a place, that would probably fall into the don't category. So more than the do. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that, a long time before COVID was something you could see in real estate is people throwing money at hard amenities, right? And I think it was then and remains a huge mistake to try to short circuit your way or shortcut your way to culture just because you've spent a lot of money on nice amenities. And I can think of several examples, right? So, um, a friend of mine that I actually met through BOMA, um, he was involved at one point in a property that had built a very expensive bocce ball court in the courtyard, right? So, I mean, that's great. There's nothing wrong with having a bocce ball court in the courtyard. But the problem is if you have tenants whose culture doesn't actually allow them to play that on that bocce ball court, right? In other
right.
words, if your boss looks out the window and sees you on the bocce ball court, he's thinking, "Well, why are you not at your desk working?" Right? Then you've essentially wasted that, right? And the same thing is true on a smaller scale. So if you have a dartboard or shuffleboard game in your office, but no one ever uses it, or if you have a coffee bar from the landlord's perspective, right? If you build out this fancy amenity space, a yoga studio, whatever it is, and no one ever uses it, then that actually is contributing to your culture in a negative way because what it's saying is that amenities for me but not for thee, or something similar to that. And it reminds me of one of my favorite uh, stories of mistakes in amenitizing an office in an attempt to build culture. And it's a company that should have known better and has now fully recovered. It's the Walt Disney Company. And it
Oh,
happened back in the 1930s and early 1940s when they built a new, essentially, studio space that included their offices out in California. And they built um, the high end layout. They organized working groups together. It was highly amenitized. They had a restaurant, they had a sundry shop, and I think they had a barber shop, had a club. They had food trucks that came. So it was this great space, a very forward thinking. But the problem is that the way their organization was structured, it was a highly hierarchical, even if it wasn't officially so. So there was a group of employees that could access all of those, and then there was a larger group of employees that were essentially priced out of all those amenities. And when they got to the space and saw, hey, here's some really nice things that exist for people that make a lot more money than us, and we can't afford to take advantage of them, that had a very severe negative impact on their culture. And it wasn't the only reason this happened, but they ended up having a huge strike of employees, and they had to put the brakes on and really think through, okay, what have we done here? Now, as I mentioned, they've recovered. They have figured out how to not only do that internally, but to deliver experiences through space pretty well. They know how to do this now. But it goes to show that you can't just amenitize your way to positive experiences, that you can actually have that backfire if you're not thinking through what the impact of that is going to be in a broad way.
right. And I think there you got to start, a lot of times the culture as we start off, talking, a lot of people want to push it from the top down, but it really needs to be something that starts with, hiring the right people, hiring a diverse mix of people, hiring people that work well together, um, and creating that ability for those people to use all of the amenities. So I think if I was creating an amenity space, I'd rather see that the space was being used by 24 call center workers. I care more about the 24 call center workers using the space than I would the one or two C levels that might go to it from once in their life. So it's definitely looking at what can be done to hit the most masses and to get that high level of engagement and people working together as a team. Many times I use an analogy. I've gone whitewater rafting, and a bad experience whitewater rafting is when you have one person in the boat that doesn't know how to row. And when you're going down class 5 rapids, you will know whether you have somebody who knows how to row, listen, and be part of the team. It's a much more enjoyable experience when you have 6 people all rowing forward, all rowing back, whatever is needed at that time. One or two bad team members creates a terrible day, because normally you go whitewater rafting, you're going for miles down the river. So, I also look at things that will create that work together, but that normally fosters good brand loyalty. It's one of those that you find that companies that do have people that all row in the same direction also are the ones that typically have a good ability to get things done, turn around projects, get build outs, get everything done. And those people seem to be the most loyal to the brand. And I think that's the good foundation for starting culture, is trying to create the right team and brand loyalty. What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, well, so that brings to mind another term that I think is related, which is engagement. And organizations like Gallup, for example, have done a great deal of research on the power of employee engagement. And what engagement means is essentially that you're bought into the purpose of the organization. Um, but to get to that point, you need a lot of things, right? You need a sense that you can trust your superiors and your coworkers. You need a sense that people are held accountable. That, in other words, there are no freeloaders who are just gonna not do their jobs and let other people take the slack for them. You need this ability to have your achievement and your contribution recognized. So all of these things are cultural elements in an organization, and they manifest in employee engagement. So Gallup has shown all sorts of positive business results from high employee engagement, from sales and profitability going way up to much lower absenteeism, much lower turnover. And so, what you want as an organization is high engagement. Now, how to get there is a little bit, it requires a little bit more thought, right? Um, One thing that you can do, though, is that you can um, strive as much as possible to be equitable in how you're using your workplace. And what I mean by that is, um, if you have a policy that lets some people work remotely but not others, or if you have a policy that lets some people have equipment like desk chairs and the extra monitor screens at home and other people don't get that, there may be on some level some accounting based justification for decisions like that, but you have to understand that those are going to contribute negatively to your sense of employee engagement in the organization. And I think the same is true as we start thinking about the new hybrid workplace, or the splitting time between home and the office and maybe spending more time than we used to remotely. Well, on the one hand, you've got employees who may not be successful or as successful at home because of the circumstances of their particular home work setup, right? Particularly if they're young parents, or if they're Gen Z people who are living either at home with their parents or with roommates. The home environment may just not work for them, right? On the other hand, you have people like working mothers who, we still have places in the US where schools aren't fully open for in-person learning yet. And so if you're going to tell those working mothers that, no, you have to come back to the office X days per week, you're putting a stress on them that is not an equitable stress relative to their contribution to your organization, as compared to others. So you've got to think about it on both ends, and having your workplace policy and strategy reinforce the positive things that you want to come out of your culture. It's not the whole answer, for sure. You can have the right workplace strategy and still have a lousy culture, as we saw from the Disney example. But you want those things to be mutually reinforcing and not competing or pushing against each other.
Oh, agree. And that brings up about rewarding people who are putting in that extra effort. And that might be the person who is working from home because she has two kids she's watching and doing schooling. Um, but creating a good environment that you reward people, and that doesn't necessarily just mean money. It could be other perks. It could be on the job training. A lot of people want to advance their knowledge in the industry and realize that technology and computer information and these systems do require more knowledge base. So being able to allow somebody to not have to take time out of their personal life to do additional training, allowing them to do training while at the office or working virtual is probably a big benefit. Any rewards you can think of, Phil, to help out the workforce who are working virtually?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to that question of meeting higher order needs, right? That it's one thing to make sure that everyone has a laptop and an internet connection. It's another thing to make sure that achievements and contributions are appropriately recognized and valued. Um, so, in a sense, remote work and remote working technology makes that easier, and in a sense it also makes it more difficult. um, and I think the challenge is figuring out, okay, well, I was recognized in this one way, but what about in this other way? So I'll give sort of a cheesy example from the retail world where you can walk into used to be able to walk into something like a Wendy's or a grocery store, and you could see, Tina Jones, Employee of the Month, with her little nameplate or maybe her photo there. So that's intended to be a public recognition of a job well done. And the same types of things exist in corporate offices where, maybe at a monthly or quarterly meeting, you will recognize people. We actually did this yesterday at my company. There was an all hands meeting virtually for most people, where we recognized people for strong performance during 2020. Um, and it was pretty interesting actually to see the overflow of that in our like internal messaging systems as we're congratulating the people that were recognized. That even spilled over into LinkedIn with people sort of offering public congratulations to their colleagues for their awards that they achieved. Yeah, some of that is organic, right? Like, no one told us, hey, share your award winners on LinkedIn.
No,
um,
and that's something that's
but what happened?
totally free too. I mean, there was no cost, no, you know, it happened organically. I mean, that's a
Right.
great piece to it is you've got the right people who work together and say, I'm going to, publicly recognize that didn't come from the top down. So it's almost like internal gamification between people.
That's right. And the reason it happened is that the way that it was communicated was broad and public and equitable enough, right? That you didn't get this sense of, here I've been slaving away and doing the same work as that guy over there, and yet he gets recognized and I don't. Like, you didn't have that sort of thing going on, in part because of the way the contributions were recognized, right?
No, that's a great one, and I've noticed so many companies that suspended doing the employee of the month during the whole COVID time. So they had the program in place, and they would have a meeting where they would recognize. But when that meeting went away, so did the employee of the month and the recognition program. Um, so
And that's another one of those things where, it can absolutely backfire. So I'm in some ways sympathetic, because if you used to do a big in-person gathering at a restaurant, once a month or once a quarter, and then all of a sudden we're all remote, and the thinking is, well, what we want to do is recognize people when they're with their colleagues so that they can receive the pats on the back and the handshakes, etc. So we're going to suspend that, right? So in other words, we don't want this to be just something that we send an email around. On one level, I'm sympathetic to that. On another level, well, now we've just stopped doing something that was contributing to the positive elements of our culture. And I think, on a going forward basis, as we've got this hybridization that's going to happen, it will be interesting to see how people try to accommodate inclusiveness in literally how we communicate recognition for people that are on the team. Is that going to be done virtually? Is it going to be done in person? Is that itself going to become a hybrid thing? I mean, that's what I think the answer should be, but I don't know that there's a single answer to that.
Well, this has been a great episode. I mean, one thing I will say that I would expect will happen is more streaming of meetings, more streaming of events. So where you did have an event that was even like the company, party, you're going to have somebody who's going to live stream that, whether to publicly or to just the employees, to make it so that the remote people are now included in that and a piece of it. So that's something that I'm making a prediction that we're going to see a lot more in 2021 and 2022 is the inclusion of the entire workforce into these even on premise in person events. But thank you for joining this episode. Got anything else you want to let people know about that's going on with you, Phil, or Aviston Young?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we've just recently published some research that's tangentially related to this conversation, and it's called The Multiverse of Work, and it's about the future of the hybridized distributed workplace, and not just workforce, but workplace, right? It's thinking about how to best generate organizational results when your workers are working at a variety of locations, because that's absolutely going to happen for a great many people, and maybe not universally, but for a great many companies, there will be some split of time between a corporate workplace and a remote workplace, and everything in between. So that contributes to or is part of what makes up your workplace culture. It's by no means all of it, but I think it's relevant to the discussion.
Thank you so much. And we'll make sure we put a link to that down in the description here on YouTube. So go down that direction, hit the more button, because YouTube always makes things have to have the more button, but click that more button and there will be a link to Phil's white paper on that down there in the description. Again, Phil, thank you so much for taking time here and doing this video podcast with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's been fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Thanks.
If you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a comment, a thumbs up, and a follow if you're not already. If you're just listening to the podcast today, be sure to check out our YouTube channel and leave us a review on whatever platform you are listening on. If you want to follow us on social media, you can find us at Moblz_COM on Instagram and Moblz on Facebook. Again, that's Moblz.